The first time I played, it was for myself alone. It was a night like so many others, heavy, pressing, filled with the silence that amplified all the thoughts I didn't want to think. The city, even at that hour, felt restless. The streets were never entirely empty, always alive with the muted echoes of distant engines, the far-off barking of a stray dog, the occasional clatter of a bottle rolling along the sidewalk. Yet despite the noise, the air felt thick with a different kind of silence, the kind that settles in when people are too tired, too defeated to fill the space with their voices. It was the silence of a city that had given up for the night, and it wrapped itself around me, weighing me down until I could barely breathe. I remember the way the air hung still, the way every sound seemed muffled as if the city itself was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered, their glow casting long, tired shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Above, the sky was clouded over, the stars hidden behind a veil of fog and darkness. The buildings loomed on either side of me, their brick facades scarred and worn as if they, too, bore the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. I had nowhere else to go, no words left to say, but I had my violin, and that was enough. So I played. The music wasn't meant for anyone. It was my way of speaking in a language only I understood, a language that carried the weight of everything I'd lost, everything that felt too broken to fix. Each note felt like a confession, a truth I couldn't voice, spilling into the empty alley and disappearing into the night. There, beneath the worn brick walls and dim streetlights, I poured out everything I couldn't carry alone. The music seemed to rise and fall with my breath, each bow stroke a release, a way to push back against the heaviness that threatened to pull me under. I remember the feel of the strings beneath my fingers, the way the vibrations traveled up through the wood of the violin and settled deep in my chest. It was as if I could feel the music in my bones, each note resonating with a part of me that words could never reach. The alley around me became my sanctuary, a place where I could let go of everything else and just exist in the sound. The brick walls that hemmed me in felt less like a prison and more like a cocoon, a space where I could be vulnerable without fear or judgment. In those moments, it didn't matter that no one was listening. I played because I needed to, because without it, the silence was too unbearable, too empty. It was the only way I knew how to fight back against the heaviness inside me. The only way to make sense of a world that seemed determined to swallow me whole. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the music started to become more than just a release. It became a balm, a way to breathe when everything else felt too tight. The city had a way of closing in on you, of making you feel small and insignificant, like just another face in the crowd. But in the alley, with my violin in hand, I felt like I could carve out a space for myself, a space where I mattered, even if only for a few fleeting moments. The night was still and vast, and in the darkness I could feel the echoes of something greater, something that connected me to the world beyond the narrow walls of the alley, to the people I could not see but knew were out there, somewhere, living their own stories, fighting their own battles. It was late, maybe past midnight, when I noticed it, the shadow at the edge of the alley. Just a movement at first, barely a flicker against the darkness. I kept my head down, my fingers moving instinctively over the strings, pretending I hadn't seen anything. It was easier that way, easier to pretend that I was alone, that the music was still just for me. But the shadows didn't leave. They stayed, lingered at the periphery of my vision, the faint glint of eyes catching the orange glow of a distant street lamp. They were listening. I don't know why they stopped, or why they stayed. Maybe like me, they were looking for something. Something to fill the silence, something to hold on to in the darkness. They never came close, never said a word, just stood there, wrapped in the night, while the music flowed through the narrow space between us. And somehow, that was enough. The shadow moved closer over the next few nights, a little at a time, until, eventually, I could make out more than just a flicker in the dark. It was a man, his face lined and weary, a uniform peeking out from beneath his coat. A police officer. My heart stuttered at the sight, fear coiling tight in my stomach. Was he here to shut me down? To tell me that this alley, this sanctuary I had claimed, wasn't mine to keep? But he didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the ground, listening as the music filled the space between us. And then there were the others. A woman with a tired face and a name tag still clipped to her scrubs, her shoulders sagging as if she carried the weight of the world. A young man with paint-stained fingers, a skateboard under one arm, his gaze distant but intent. An older woman who brought a small folding chair and sat quietly, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. They came one by one until I wasn't just playing for myself anymore. I was playing for them too. They were strangers, all of them, but in that alley we found something we all needed, a place to let go, to breathe, to exist without the weight of everything else pressing down on us. The music was no longer just mine, it belonged to all of us. A thread that connected us in the darkness, that made the city feel a little less cold, a little less indifferent. And though I still stayed hidden, still kept my head down and my face in the shadows, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the music could be enough. Not just for me, but for all of us. The nights continued to blur together, each one a variation of the last, and still they came. The shadows grew in number, and the alley became a gathering place, not for the lost and broken, but for those who sought something they couldn't name. I could see it in their eyes, the way they lingered just outside the pool of light cast by the flickering street lamp, their bodies tense as if waiting for permission to let go. They were like me, caught in a world that often felt harsh, relentless, but here, in the darkness, we found a moment of peace. I never spoke to them. I didn't need to. The music was our language, the notes carrying the emotions we couldn't put into words. I watched as they came closer, night after night, until the alleyway was filled with silent figures. Each one a story I would never fully know, but felt deeply connected to. There was the officer. He came every night, his shoulders hunched beneath his uniform jacket, the weariness of his job etched into his face. He never looked at me directly, always keeping his gaze fixed on the ground, as if acknowledging me would shatter whatever fragile understanding we had. But he was there, and that was enough. And then there was the nurse. She always stood at the back, her eyes closed, her face tilted upward as if she could feel every note I played deep in her bones. I imagined her long shifts, the relentless hours under the harsh hospital lights, the weight of other people's pain pressing down on her. Here, in the darkness, she seemed to find a release, her tense posture softening as the music wrapped around her. The young man with the skateboard, he intrigued me the most. His eyes were sharp, his gaze never wavering, always fixed on me as if trying to decipher something hidden beneath the music. He would come closer than the others, sometimes leaning against the brick wall, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his thigh. One night, I noticed his hands covered in bright paint, the kind that would be used for street art. The next day, a mural appeared on the opposite wall, an abstract of flowing lines and colors that seemed to echo the music I played. It was as if he had taken the melody and turned it into something tangible, something permanent. The older woman with the folding chair was a mystery. She always arrived at the same time, using the same deliberate movements, setting her chair just far enough away that she could sit unnoticed, but close enough that she was part of the gathering. She never opened her eyes, her hands resting calmly on her knees, her lips sometimes moving in silent rhythm with the notes. I wondered who she was, what had led her here, but I never asked. None of us did. It was an unspoken rule. We did not intrude on each other's stories. We were just there, together, in that moment. As the nights passed, I started to notice the changes. The officer stood a little straighter, the tired lines around his eyes softening. The nurse smiled, just once, but it was enough to make my heart swell with something like pride. The young man painted more, his murals appearing on walls throughout the neighborhood, bursts of color that seemed to breathe life into the gray, tired streets. The older woman began to hum along, her voice barely audible, but it was there, a quiet harmony that filled the gaps between my notes. The alley became a place of transformation. It was still dark, still shadowed, but it was different now. It felt alive, vibrant, as if the music had seeped into the very walls, changing them. The people who came were no longer just shadows. They were part of something bigger, something we had built together without ever speaking a word. And I too felt the change. The fear that had once gripped me, the need to stay hidden, began to loosen its hold. I still played with my head down, my face obscured by the brim of my hat, but there were moments, fleeting but real, when I wanted to look up, to see them fully, to let them see me. The music had given me a voice, but maybe it could give me the courage to step out from the shadows. The music became a thread that wove us together, night after night, each of us bringing our own pain, our own hope, and adding it to the melody. I began to recognize the patterns in their lives, the officer's weary steps that seemed lighter as he left, the nurse's tired eyes that held a sparkle of something more, the young man's murals that grew more intricate, more hopeful. The older woman's hums became stronger, a steady accompaniment that filled the alley with warmth. One night, as I played, I noticed something different. The alley, usually cloaked in shadows, seemed brighter. Someone had strung up fairy lights, delicate strands of light that hung above us, casting a soft golden glow over the gathering. I paused for a moment, my bow hovering above the strings, my breath caught in my throat. It was beautiful. An offering, a sign that this place had become something more than just an alley. It had become a sanctuary, a place where we could all find a little light in the darkness. The young man stood beneath the lights, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in years. I lowered my bow, letting the last note fade into the night, and for the first time, I lifted my head fully, letting my eyes meet those of the people around me. They were watching me, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lights, their eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or hope, or maybe just the simple acknowledgement that we were all here, together, in this moment. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs, and I felt the fear that had held me back begin to unravel, replaced by something else, something stronger. I raised my bow again, my fingers finding their place on the strings, and I began to play. This time, the music wasn't just for me. It was for all of us, a celebration of the light we had found in each other, the hope that had grown in the shadows. The notes soared, filling the alley, and as I played, I felt the walls around me fall away, the darkness lifting, replaced by the warmth of the people who had gathered here night after night to listen. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. We weren't alone. The music had brought us together, had given us a place to belong, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.